structures, and that was actually not intended for publication. It was notes for an undergraduate linguistics course at MIT, which at that time this material was basically unpublishable. It did not belong in any recognized field. I had submitted a couple of articles to journals which were returned. I'd submitted a book for publication, and it was returned, MIT Press. It was returned with the sensible comment that this didn't seem to belong anywhere, and I ought to wait until the field exists before trying to submit a book, which was not an unreasonable comment. It did come out 20 years later. By then the field had been established. The first syntactic structures was actually notes, which a Dutch publisher who visited saw sitting on my desk and asked if I would put it together and let them publish it as a monograph, and they did.
What was your first political book?
First political book was American Power and the New Mandarins, which was a collection of essays, came out in 1969. It's just been reprinted. It was essays and talk, mostly, a lot of them based on talks through the 1960s. Starting around 1963, I became pretty much involved in Vietnam War issues, and was giving many talks, usually to audiences of 2 or 3 people. There was absolutely no interest at the time. But over the years it built up, and by the late 60s there were way more invitations and opportunities than I could take up. I was also directly involved in activism and resistance. I have to say, for years, every time I came to Washington, the first thought that came to mind was the smell of tear gas. It was in and out of demonstrations, in and out of jail a number of times. The essays were a collection of, in the book, were a collection of talks, commentary, discussions based on these activities.
I have on my lap here a Norman Mailer book called The Armies of the Night, and up at the top is a picture of you back in 1967. What were you doing there at the Pentagon?
That was a big demonstration at the Pentagon in, I suppose it was October 1967. One of the first large-scale national demonstrations, not the first, but one of the biggest on a national level. Actually, Mailer and I ended up in adjacent cots in a detention center somewhere after we were arrested.
Over the years, lots of controversy, lots of books. We're going to go to the phones in about 10 minutes, and they'll have a chance to deal with these. But the other book that I have in my lap, and I've got a lot of your books, is one, it's a small one. It's called 9/11, and it was a bestseller. What's your main point in this book about 9/11?
Well, that book is a collection of interviews. It's a sample of interviews, and it happens to be just those that happen to be electronically stored. So, for example, it doesn't include interviews on BBC and so on. Right after 9/11, there was a massive requests from the United States and around the world for discussion of the events, their background, what they meant, what they were going to lead to, and this is a slightly edited collection of a number of those interviews. The point was, if there is a single point, that we should be aware of the role that we play in the world. What happened on 9/11 is a horrifying atrocity. It's probably the worst single act of large-scale terror that's ever taken place. I don't think there's another single case where thousands of people were killed in one act. On the other hand, for much of the world, the response to 9/11 was welcome to the club. We've been through this, and you've often done it to us. So, for example, I've forgotten whether I quoted it in there, but the research journal of the Jesuit University in Managua, Nicaragua, which is one of the main research journals in Central America. They published an editorial immediately after 9/11, describing it, as everyone did, as a horrifying atrocity, expressing sympathy for the victims, saying you could call it Armageddon. And then they added, but we have been through our own Armageddon in slow motion, under massive terrorist attack organized and directed by the United States, which led to tens of thousands of people killed and the country practically ruined. It may never recover. So we do sympathize with the terrible atrocity that was carried out against you, but it's not unfamiliar to us. And that was a reaction through a good deal of the world. That's why if you look at there was an international Gallup poll taken shortly after September 11th. I think it was about September 20th, or roughly in that, about a week after, asking, this was at a time when the bombing of Afghanistan had in effect been announced, but it had not yet been undertaken, so it was in that interim period. And the question asked around the world was, do you support, if what it said actually is, if the perpetrators of the terrorist attack are identified on that assumption, would you be in favor of bombing the place where they came from, their refuge? And then there were two questions. If it attacked only military targets, second, if it also hit civilians. Well, it was never published in the United States, but the responses were interesting. There was very little support for the policy that was actually undertaken. And incidentally, we should say that they hadn't identified the perpetrators. But in Latin America, which is the region of most experience with U.S. domination and intervention, the support was extremely low. It ranged from about 2% in support in Mexico to about 11%, I think, in Colombia and Venezuela. The only marginal exception was Panama, which has a very Anglo an American component there. And even there, 16% supported bombing. I think 80% supported diplomatic means, efforts for extradition. And that reflects a history of experience, long experience. So yes, all over the world there was overwhelming sympathy for the victims, horror of the terrible atrocity, but a recognition that life's more complicated. We've been on the receiving end for a long time from European imperialism, which was violent and destructive, and from the U.S. variant of it. And I think it's only first of all, it's the merest honesty to face this. But if we're interested in reducing the threat of terrorism, which is enormous, if you want to really be frightened, read the recent Hart-Rudman study, sponsored study of the Council on Foreign Relations on terrorist threats to the United States, and they're pretty awesome. Well, if you hope to reduce and lessen these threats, you have to make a crucial distinction between the terrorists themselves, who are carrying out criminal acts, and you treat it like criminal acts, and the reservoir of in which their message kind of resonates, even among people who hate and despise them, but nevertheless recognize some authenticity to what they say. And it's that reservoir of, you can't really call it sympathy, but understanding, where real grievances lie that have to be dealt with. That's true no matter what kind of terrorism you're facing. If you want to reduce the threat, pay attention to the grievances from which they arise, and if they're legitimate, and they often are, deal with them. For one thing, because they're legitimate. For another, because it's just sanity if you're hoping to reduce the terror. These are topics discussed in the book, in their interviews.
Just tuned in. Noam Chomsky is our guest, and we're going to go to the phones. We have a call from Maryville, Illinois. First up, go ahead, please.
Hello, Dr. Chomsky. I was introduced to your writings and works as an undergraduate about 4 years ago at the University of Illinois, and I was intrigued by your, by the straightforwardness that you had in your writings, and I first read them on ZNet. And anyway, my question, it's a two-part question. They're unrelated parts. My first question is, where do you attribute the incompetence of today's leaders in this country as compared to, the leaders such as FDR and, in the early 20th century, men of distinction and honor? I know, presidents like Andrew Jackson and some other ones were, not very honorable. But where do you attribute this? I mean, it's been decades now where we've had leaders, one after the other, just promote these policies and enact these these wars and these where do you attribute that to?
Thanks, caller. That's good.
Well, I'm not sure I would use the word incompetence. I mean, I think they're very competent. They know what they're doing. They're dedicated, committed. They even tell us very frankly what they're doing. So, for example, the national security strategy that was announced last September was a very clear, brazen statement of a program of sustaining world dominance by means of force, and announcing the intention to rely on force to suppress any potential challenge to that dominance. Now, that's quite a departure as a policy statement, and it sent many shudders around the world, including the foreign policy elite at home. But there's nothing incompetent about it. It's a very clear, explicit statement, frank statement. Why they're pursuing those policies, well, we can look at them. But if we take an honest look at the past, it's not very pretty. I mean, we can ask, for example, why we're sitting where we're sitting. There were people here, after all, lots of them, millions of them. What happened to them? Well, the founding fathers were pretty frank about it. They knew what they were doing. So John Quincy Adams, for example, many years after his own very ugly contributions to this were over, did have a change of heart, and he condemned what they had done in what he called exterminating the hapless race of Native Americans with ferocious cruelty, or words approximately like that. They understood what they were doing. They cleared the continent. They conquered half of Mexico in a war which was bitterly condemned within the country. Correctly, it was a terrible war. A century ago, the United States conquered the Philippines, killed a couple 100,000 people. That a good part of the military command ended up facing war crimes trials afterwards. There was bitter condemnation of that too. Mark Twain, for example, the leading, maybe the leading writer in the United States, wrote very bitter, sardonic anti-war essays, and we can go on. The history has not been a pretty one, and that's why after the national territory was conquered, power extended to the region. The United States was not a major actor in the global scene until after Second World War, but it was regionally the dominant power in the Caribbean and Central America, extending to Hawaii, which was taken from its own citizens by force and guile, onto the Philippines, but particularly in Central America and the Caribbean. And those are not, if you take a look at the record there, it's not at all attractive.
Washington, D.C., for Noam Chomsky, good morning.
Good day. Well, there's more like 300,000 in the Philippines, and that's my point and my disagreement with Mr. Chomsky. It's too general, Mr. Chomsky. It has to be specific as a prosecutor and factually, and the facts are known. The body counts are well known, and everyone quotes them incorrectly. That's my disagreement with you. I like your work very much, and many people follow you, but I think you need to, if Hussein's criminal to be prosecuted, then our involvement and participation and Helmut Kohl's involvement and participation in the 80s is a prosecutable crime also.